Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to Adrian's Digital Basement. On today's video, we're going to be taking a look at this little mystery device, along with this pretty bog standard motherboard. So without further ado, let's get right to it. This little interesting device falls into the interesting category for PC hardware. And I love this kind of weird stuff that's not very well documented and no one's really seen or knows much about. So when I look at this thing, I can't really tell what it is. There's really not much writing on it other than made in the USA right there. And on the top there's a sticker that says E4C-7 and over here E4 Rev C. And on the little paper label there, 0.001. There's a heatsink attached to a surface mount chip. There's a 2-pin connector of some type there. There's a 74 logic IC right there, some passive components. And if we flip this over, this is some type of connector here that looks like it would plug onto a processor on a motherboard. Right here, copyright 1995, made in the USA. Sorry, there's a bit of glare, there we go. And I did some searching around and I really couldn't find much information on the markings that are on here at all looking on the internet. Now, if we grab the motherboard I said we were gonna look at, this is a pretty bog standard 386SX PC motherboard. This one actually happens to have a 40 megahertz 386SX made by AMD, but I've actually underclocked it down to 20 megahertz because if indeed this is a little accelerator, I'd like to see what kind of performance boost we get on a more typical 386SX motherboard. Overclocking or underclocking this particular motherboard is quite easy because the crystal oscillator here is in a socket, so you can just pop this out and replace it with a different one. You take the speed of the oscillator, which is 40 megahertz, and you divide that by 2, and that becomes the CPU clock. One thing to consider about the 386SX, if you're not familiar, is that it's essentially a 286 with 386 instructions in it. Intel created the 386SX not as an inexpensive upgrade path specifically for users, but for PC manufacturers and the manufacturers of motherboards. It is my understanding that the difference between a 386SX motherboard and a 286 motherboard are very minimal. The CPU still has a 16-bit external data bus just like the 286, which means it's impossible to have local bus slots or PCI slots with an SX, as well as the RAM is accessed 16 bits at a time. It's kind of like the 8088 versus the 8086. The 8088 was a cost-reduced version of the 8086 that only had an 8-bit external data bus, which was cheaper and simpler to make for the manufacturers, but did hinder performance. If this motherboard had a 386DX on here, then the RAM would be accessed 32 bits at a time. That would mean you'd need all 4 of these RAM sockets installed at a time for the machine to even boot. But on an SX like this, because it's a 16-bit bus like a 286, you only need 2 of these SIMs at a time. These 30-pin memory modules are only 8 bits wide each. This socket on this motherboard looks like it might be for a 286, but it's actually for a 3D7SX, which is the Mathco processor that pairs with this. It's a different chip than the one for the DX processors. You can't just use the same Mathco processor from a DX on the SX. So with all that said, the reason why I think this is an accelerator for a 386SX is because this very unusual socket on the bottom here looks suspiciously like a socket that can be pushed down on top of this quad flat pack package here. Now it's probably something that would be unobtainium at this point in time. Like these were made either specifically for debugging purposes or for products like this. I doubt it's possible to buy something like this anymore. When you look at this little PCB here, you see there's a white painted notch right here in this corner that doesn't match the other 4. And on the motherboard here, there's also a notch right here that would indicate that is pin 1. There's also a little divot on the processor there. If I take this, this actually does push down onto the processor. I'm just aligning it correctly first. There we go. and I give it a push, and it's actually on the motherboard, and it's on there pretty firmly, like that doesn't just fall off. Now, if this motherboard were in a computer that was going to be shipped and drop kicked, this might actually pop off because it is not too hard to get this off. In fact, if I just use this little plastic tool here, just pry up on the corners a little bit, it will pop off. But I assume a little bit of hot glue right there in the center of the processor, or perhaps right here in the center of this socket. And when then you push this on while it's hot, that might make it stay on that much better. Now, when we take a look at the chip that's underneath the heatsink, and it is attached with epoxy, so I can't easily get that off, it appears to be exactly the same size as this one here. So I don't really know what's going on here. Is this perhaps just a faster version of the 386SX? Is this designed to go on like a 16 megahertz machine and it bumps it up to, say, 33 megahertz? It's like clock doubled? Or is it something like a 46 SLC? There was a 46 that was made in the same exact package here as the 386SX, so it had the same 16-bit limitation, so it didn't have the full performance of a 46, but it was a very easy upgrade path for even 286 machines, because it was my understanding there were actually 286 to 386SX upgrade paths, and there was definitely a 286 to 486 upgrade little plug-in PCB, kind of like this, except its socket on the bottom here was designed to go into the 286 PLC-C socket like this, and then it used that same, I think it was a Cyrix 46 SLC, or was it IBM branded chip? I think there were a couple manufacturers of that particular 46 chip, so I'm not sure who was making it on the Make It 46 little upgrade. But I'm kind of thinking that this little board here perhaps has a 46 SLC in there, and when you plug it into this board, it will just seamlessly upgrade it to that faster processor. Now, one thing I am curious about is the Make It 46, which is the 286 to 486 upgrade. You have to remove the 286, and then the little upgrade processor plugs into the socket, kind of like this. That's just a recreation, of course. So it doesn't have to worry about the original chip being in there anymore. Clearly, there's no way to remove the 386SX, so how exactly does plugging this in on top of that chip disable the onboard processor? Well, I was giving that a little thought, and I haven't done any research yet, but I am wondering if that Intel included a pin on the processor that, say, when pulled low, disables the processor. On a motherboard like this, where there's no main second processor slot, that line is probably left disconnected, or perhaps it's just pulled up too high with like a 10K resistor. So when you connect this up, what it probably does is ground that pin, and I'm assuming it's ground. It grounds that pin, which will disable the onboard processor altogether, so all of its inputs and outputs go high impedance, and then this processor here can take over. So I think the first thing I need to do is connect this up to the motherboard. Let's do that. So we'll just line up the notch to the notch. Let's give this a good push down onto it. Okay, there we go. And I need to set this up with the video card and everything. Let's see if this thing even boots. I'm going to set this up with my usual slew of cards. I have a VGA card from Trident. I have a regular Gold Star Prime 2 I'm going to be using for the hard drive interface, along with floppy, although floppy's not connected to anything, so I can just remove the cable. We'll connect up a regular postcard here so we can monitor for activity of the machine, make sure it's actually booting. And I do know this computer works, this motherboard works fine with the original processor, that is, because I have tested that. I'm going to plug in this little board here, which is an XT IDE BIOS. That's just for booting the SD card that I have connected to the IDE card. The original BIOS on this motherboard doesn't support large disks. And then finally, I have this little prototype card here where I have some pins installed. That allows me to use my oscilloscope just to monitor the ISA bus speed. All right, so the processor upgrade is definitely installed on the motherboard. It's right here. And then keep your eyes peeled right here on these two 7-segment displays that it's sideways. But that will show the computer's actually booting if it starts to work. All right, and here we go. Oh, okay. So it stopped at 40, but you know what? I don't think that's actually a problem of the processor upgrade. I've had that problem on this motherboard before where it just kind of is unhappy about something. Let's just power it off and power back on again. Oh, there we go. We got video. All right, it's booting. So that's a good sign. Oh, look, it says Cyrix 46 SLC right there. All right, I ran check CPU, and oddly it says it's a classic 46 running at an internal speed of 22.6 megahertz. This figure is not accurate when L1 cache is disabled. I don't know if it's disabled or not. Oh, it is disabled actually. Internal L1 cache is disabled. Let me reboot into the BIOS because I do kind of remember that there was a setting inside the BIOS on this motherboard that lets me control the internal cache. And with the onboard 3D6, that doesn't actually do anything. I've rebooted here into the BIOS because I remember there was an internal cache memory setting. Here it is. Oh, and I could not set it to enabled when I was running on the 386 because the 386SX on here does not have an internal cache, but this 46 does. Now it does say here external cache memory on this motherboard. Pretty sure that that's not a thing. There is no external cache on this motherboard, but it's set to enabled anyways. Okay, so running this again, we still have the same speed, 22.9 megahertz. It does say the internal cache is enabled in write-through mode. So the funny thing is the crystal oscillator right here is 40 megahertz. Divide by 2 runs the processor at exactly 20 megahertz. So it's funny that it's reporting that this is 23 megahertz. So I'm wondering if there's a little bit of some kind of an overclock or something happening inside this processor. Incidentally, the ISA bus is reporting 10 megahertz right now. This is the actual signal that's coming across the bus. And that's because I have the clock signal divided by 2 to drive the ISA bus. If I go to divide by 3, which is the next setting available, it runs it at, of course, 6.666 megahertz, which is underclocking the ISA bus a little bit. Ideally, ISA should run around 8 megahertz, but 10 megahertz is pretty much fine. ISA is very tolerant of a wide range of speeds. The original XT, of course, ran the ISA bus at 4.77 megahertz. Then the AT ran it at 6, and then the later AT, the 286s from IBM, ran it at 8. And that's kind of where people settled. 8 megahertz was the normal speed for ISA. Most cards can run perfectly at 10. Often 12 is fine as well. And you get a little performance increase, of course, by doing that. Now, looking at the tools I have on this SD card, I do not have the utilities for the Make It 46 card. Because the 286 motherboard has no way to enable the cache memory, especially the L1 cache on this 46 processor, they create a little DOS utility that would enable it in software after you boot it up. Luckily, this particular motherboard seems to support that in the BIOS, but if you're using an accelerator like this and it doesn't have that option, like say it's an older 386SX board, then you're gonna have to run that Make It 46 utility after you boot to get the performance increase that you definitely should with a 46 chip like this. Okay, great. So I know that this accelerator works. What I want to do now is take it off the board and run some benchmarks on the 36SX at the 20 megahertz speed. Now, while that's not the maximum speed of this 36SX, it's a very typical 36SX speed. And with chips like the 36SX on this motherboard, the clock speed makes performance scale linearly. So if you run it at 16 megahertz and 33 megahertz, it's essentially double the speed. Everything runs twice as fast. Well, not quite everything, because the ISA bus runs at a fixed clock speed, and there might be some RAM wait states, but the way the processor executes the instructions, it's double the speed. So if we go from 20 to 40 on this motherboard with the 36SX, it's just gonna be twice as fast. And I can pretty much assume that the 46 is going to work in exactly the same way. It's just going to be twice as fast if I run it at a faster clock speed. So I'm going to do my testing at 20 megahertz first, and then I want to try to overclock or at least clock up this 46 chip. It's going to run at 20 megahertz right now, or 22 or whatever. Then I'll switch out the crystal on this board to the 80 megahertz crystal, which I know runs perfectly stable on this motherboard. And then that should run the 46 at, I guess, 44 megahertz, because it seems to report a slightly faster clock speed anyways. Okay, so first I just need to pop off the chip here. Well, that came off very easily, just that easy. And now time for some quick benchmarks. All right, landmark speed test, we're getting 30.59 megahertz. And check it 3.0, we're getting 5262 dry stones and 95.5 thousand wet stones. And running SpeedSys doesn't work because I only have 4 megs of RAM on this motherboard and I don't have memory modules handy to go over 4 megabytes. It actually looks like it will be able to give us a processor benchmark though. I don't think it's going to do any of the RAM testing though. And there is the processor score at 4.35. And for top bench, we're getting a score of 47 with a total microseconds of 1,480. I'm going to say it's jumping around a little bit. It coincides with a machine, the Dell 310A, which has a 36DX, but don't let that fool you. That is only the case because the video speed on this particular thing, VidMem, actually has a lower microseconds by quite a bit. And that makes up for the memory slowdown. See memtest, memEA, and then the opcode, which is the processor itself, is not running as quick because it's running code out of RAM, which of course is slow on this motherboard because it's 16-bit access. The video memory is probably a bit faster on this machine because I overclocked the ISA bus to 10 megahertz. All right, and let's run 3D bench here. This is gonna be really slow on this particular machine. The speed of your video card and the bus it's connected to make a big difference on this test as well. So it's gonna be hamstrung by the fact that the ISA bus is relatively slow compared to, say, local bus on a real 46 or a Pentium or 46 with PCI. Okay, well, it gave me a benchmark of 67.7, which doesn't seem to make sense. I'm gonna write that down, but I don't think this is a valid test because this is running at like a few frames per second, not 67.7. All right, so off with the computer and let's put this back on. Let's upgrade this with just pushing something onto the motherboard. I mean, that's honestly one of the simplest upgrades I've ever seen. Power this up. Is it gonna beep at me? Nope, it seems to work. Gonna go into the BIOS and turn on that cache because it probably turned off. No, it's still enabled. Awesome. Well, I am curious about using the SETMUL utility here. Let's see if it actually supports any of the features of this 46 SLC. Oh, it says it can actually enable and disable the cache, the level 1 cache. So let's try disabling the level 1 cache. So that would be L1D, disabling L1 cache. And let's look at landmark speed test results really quickly. Okay, below scale, 45 megahertz. SETMUL L1E for enable. It works. So that's awesome. If you have a motherboard that does not support turning on the L1 cache in the BIOS like this one, use the SETMUL utility to do it on the fly. It would work for any 46 SLC upgrade on an older motherboard that has no ability to do that. Very handy little tidbit. All right, well, while we're in here, we're getting a score of 83.72 megahertz, which is a big improvement over the 30.59 we got with the original processor. In Check-It, we're getting 8959 dry stones. On the previous processor, we got 5262, and we're getting 172.3 thousand wet stones, and on the original processor, we were getting 95.5. And SpeedSys gave us a remarkable performance increase. The score is 10.65. And the previous score was 4.35. In Top Bench, our score is 65 now, and previously it was 47. The specific opcode test now is running at 206, 207, and before was 230. I didn't write down what the mem test and the mem EA speeds were, but they actually look slower now than they were before. And here we are in 3D Bench. Let's see if this even appears to be running faster. Perhaps. It's pretty sluggish nonetheless, but I guess it's faster. All right, now this is a little further into the test. Definitely, there's a big improvement in speed. Okay, and the frames per second appeared to calculate properly on the test now because it's getting 9.4, which is definitely faster. It ran faster than the old test, which was 67.7. Clearly, I have to ignore this test. So I created a little chart showing the performance improvement between the 386SX20 and the 46SLC20. Here's a graph showing the change, and in all cases the red bar is bigger, which is better, except for the opcode test where a smaller bar is actually faster. And on this graph you can see how many times faster the 46 is compared to the 386. I'm going to take my little box of crystals here, and I have an 80 megahertz and a 66. Let's just go right to 80. Which will run this processor at 40 megahertz, a supposed 40 megahertz. All right, let's see what goes. I'm getting the postcode. I know you can't see that in this camera, but it is actually posting. Awesome. Now, because I didn't change the BIOS, it's now running the ISA at 20 megahertz, which I don't think that's gonna work. But the computer actually booted? That's a bit surprising. Okay. Well, let's try running some benchmarks with the ISA bus running at 20 megahertz. What's gonna happen? All right, well, this is now running at 167 megahertz, which is basically exactly twice as fast as before. It was 83.72. I'm really just interested to know if this particular 46 upgrade chip can run at 40 megahertz like it is now, because perhaps it was rated for, say, 33 or even 25 megahertz, and now it's a serious overclock. So far, so good. Check it basically exactly doubled the performance it was getting before. The scaling is linear, and that's going to be the same for the 36 on here and the 46. It's more just about stability. And SpeedSys also gave us double the performance. In Top Bench, almost everything doubled. I don't think video memory did, but it's now saying that the closest match of a machine is an Intel 46 DX266. Now, a good chunk of that is because the VidMem, if you notice, is a lot faster on this machine than it is on the 46, and that's because of that serious overclock on the ISA bus. This video card is running more than twice as fast as it should, so it's gonna have a lot more throughput than it would otherwise. And exiting out of there, the computer just locked up. We're getting a black screen. I can't hit Control-Delete. I'm gonna have to power cycle it. What I'm gonna do is go back in the BIOS here, and I just turned on auto config. That is gonna set the bus speed back to the correct speed. It's gonna be divided by 5, I think. I think there's a little routine in the BIOS that detects what your clock speed is, and then it basically sets up all the other parameters appropriately. I think the instability was probably due to the overclocked ISA bus, more so than the processor itself not handling this 40 megahertz speed. Okay, so not a lot changed except for the video memory. That's the main thing that changed, and probably the 3D game thing, because that also is affected by the speed of the video card. And actually, when I exited Top Bench, it froze again. So maybe that is an overclock symptom. It's kind of strange that nothing else has gone wrong on this thing, except for this one thing. Well, in that case, I'm going to turn this auto config back off, and we're going to re-overclock the bus back up to 20 megahertz. Why not? It was working seemingly fine. And I was trying to run 3D Bench, and it just crashed right out. And the computer is actually frozen right now, even though it says file error. All right, back in the BIOS, I will set this back to auto. There we go. So that should downclock the ISA bus again. And just so everyone can see, there it is, running at pretty much exactly 8 megahertz. And let's see if this can run now. If this still crashes out, this could be the processor being overclocked in a way that it's not happy about. So maybe 40 megahertz is too fast for this thing. All right, so the test finished, but it cut off the bottom of the screen, so I can't even read the performance metric here. So that screams like there's a problem, because this did run perfectly fine when I didn't overclock the processor. Oh, look, it just froze. Oh, wait, it didn't freeze. What's going on? Now it's just showing weird junk. Okay, clearly something's wrong. Let's see if the processor is hot. It's not. It's not even hot at all. But there's definite seeming corruption on this benchmark here. So I guess I'll downclock this to 33 megahertz, and let's see if 3D Bench is performing better. So here is a 66 megahertz crystal. Pop this on the motherboard here. That's why I love this motherboard. It's so easy to swap the crystal. Here's check CPU, just telling us that it's definitely running at 38.2 megahertz, so I guess 33 plus a little bit. The ISA bus right now is running at 8.3 megahertz, so a slight overclock, and that's that auto function. It's able to calculate the speed and figure out the right divider for the ISA bus. All right, 3D Bench. Will this crash or will it work? It crashed. So does that mean that this chip is only rated to run at like 25 megahertz and I'm overclocking it. One would think it would be hot if I were overclocking it, but this utility is freezing. And we definitely saw that it ran perfectly at the original 20 megahertz speed. What's going on here? This is weird. All right, in with the 80 megahertz crystal, which gives us that nice 40 megahertz speed. There's that post-error 31 again. It does that every time. It's so strange. Should be able to get this working with one more power cycle, and there we go. It came right up. Okay, 3D bench again, and that's with 40 megahertz, but I pushed the CPU accelerator down onto the original chip. Nope, look at that. It corrupted in exactly the same way. It did let me exit the demo though. Let's run it again. That's so weird it's corrupting like that. And I know it's not the ISA bus being overclocked because it's running at the correct auto speed, so 8 megahertz. If this messes up again, I'm gonna definitely conclude that this 46 chip is a 33 megahertz part and 40 is a bit too fast for it. Look at that, same exact corruption. Very strange. It's weird that the computer doesn't crash too. Let's see if top bench can run without crashing when I exit. Well, it doesn't crash now. Weird, what's happening? Well, I kind of have the ultimate stress test. I'm not sure this will work actually because only 4 megs of RAM, but let's try running Doom. Will it actually work? I'm not sure it works with 4 megs. Let's see. Okay, well, Doom ran. Let's see what the performance is like. I have sound disabled because I don't have a sound card in this machine. Okay, it's very slow, and we expected that, right? Because it's a 46, doesn't have a Mathco processor. I'd be more curious if it would crash though. It's not crashing. So is this chip capable of 40 megahertz? I mean, what explains that glitch we were seeing in the 3D benchmark while Doom is working? I mean, this is fine. This is completely playable, and there's no way this would be playable on the 386. I mean, it would be a slideshow. I mean, this is not great, let me tell you. It's obviously you can see this frame rate is not super good, and I don't even have the screen full size. But on the other hand, if this is all I had back in the day, I'd be happy with this. It's playable. And excuse my bad Doom playing. This is not representative of what I can actually do. I usually play on a mouse and a WASD, and I don't use the arrow keys like I'm using right here. I'm just loading up Arkanoid here, see if this works. Oh, let me unplug the speaker. Don't want to hear this working through the postcard. It's got the speaker on it. Well, it appears to be working. Oh yeah, I mean, this game would run on an XT, so it's not much of a performance test here. All right, well, I think that's about all the testing I'm gonna do for this thing. I just popped it off there. One thing I'm noticing right now is the bottom of this is actually kind of hot. And when I touch this processor on the motherboard, it's quite warm. So I'm wondering that even though this was disabled by this accelerator card, maybe this thing is still running internally at 40 megahertz, waiting to respond, because it gets warm when it's normally running at 40 megahertz. Because the 46SX chip, if I touch the sides of the heatsink, it's warm, but it's less warm than this 386 chip. Well, this is a pretty cool little part. I actually didn't know anything like this existed. I think I had heard about it, but I've certainly never seen one in person. Something that could just plug onto a surface mount chip and disable it so easily without having to desolder or do anything. This was really a simple upgrade, and the performance gains were really substantial. And I wanted to test that crystal oscillator change specifically because say you had a computer that was running at 16 or 20 megahertz and you pop this on there, theoretically, you could then overclock the entire motherboard with a faster crystal and get some good performance gains. Of course, a lot of the older, more simple 386SX motherboards don't have a way to control the ISA clock speed or any of the other memory timings. So when you overclock it with a new crystal, it will alter all of that stuff, and it might cause issues and stability problems due to, say, memory timing or other problems like that that have nothing to do with the fact that this processor seems to work pretty much perfectly at 40 megahertz. So if you happen to be digging around through boxes of retro stuff and you find one of these little unmarked things like this that look like this, then that's a pretty cool, rare little device. I'd love to find out more about this. Like, I've done some Googling and I can't find a brand name or anything about what this is. So definitely my viewers, please use your sleuthing skills to try to figure out what this is. Maybe we can figure out what brand it is, what the packaging looks like, maybe even a manual for it. Perhaps we can even figure out what the actual clock speed rating of this is. So I think that's going to be it for this video. If you found it interesting, I'd definitely appreciate a thumbs up. Big thanks to all my patrons. Their names are scrolling up the side of the screen right now. And if you want to become a patron, you can do so at the link in the description below. There's my second channel if you haven't already seen that. A lot of mail call stuff going on over there. Shorter, faster mail call episodes that come out more quickly. So check out the link in the description below if you haven't already. And I guess that's going to be it. Yeah, put your comments down below. I'd love to hear what you think about this little interesting accelerator. And I guess that's going to be it. So stay healthy, stay safe, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.